the ageless wisdom has been called the perennial philosophy as well. It's ageless because it's timeless. It's the same verities and truths that exist throughout all time. And the ageless wisdom teachings come through to us in many forms, through mythology, through various amanuenses who have been transmitters of the teachings from the hierarchy of the masters of wisdom, through the ancient Vedas, of course, through the spiritual traditions that exist universally. Mythology is one of the great keys to studying the mysteries, because the mysteries are encoded in mythology, in Greek mythology, in Scandinavian mythology, in mythology of all traditions. Like music, mythology is one of the great universal languages that we can understand and which anyone can tap into quite easily for understanding the archetypes of the gods that are described in the various stories. In mythology, we have the stories of all the planets and their relationship to one another, personified by the planetary gods. We have Zeus, Jupiter, and Mars, and Venus, and Mercury. They all have these various stories which describe their interrelationship with one another.
I tried very early in my psychedelic research, you see, to create a cartography that would somehow have place for all the types and levels of experiences that come in non-ordinary states. I originally thought that I was working on a new map for psychology, which was made possible by this powerful catalyst, this tool, which was LSD. Because every time you have a new tool in science, new areas open up for study, like when the microscope came into medicine and biology, or where the telescope came into astronomy. Entirely new domains of observation open up. I worked for a little over 2 years on this map, and when I finally had it together so that it covered all the major types of experiences that we see in non-ordinary states, it also dawned on me that this was not a new map at all, that this was a rediscovery and kind of modern reformulation of a map that in various variations, modifications, existed really not for centuries, but possibly for millennia. This is what Aldous Huxley called perennial philosophy. And I saw the link to yoga, to Tibetan Buddhism, to Sufism, to Christian mysticism, the Kabbalah, and you name it, shamanism. And again, in terms of the mythological unconscious, or archetypal, as Jung calls it, suddenly there would be mythological images of deities representing death, rebirth. Because our own, model in this culture, the Judeo-Christian culture, would be Christ suffering, death on the cross, and then resurrection. But some other people would go into other cultures, whether they know them intellectually or not, whether they're familiar with those mythologies. So, for example, Osiris would be the Egyptian counterpart, or it could be Attis, Adonis, it could be Dionysus, and so on. This comes from different cultures, again from the archetypal aspect, the mythological aspect of the collective unconscious. So this is a very, very important domain in the psyche, and a full conscious experience of that level leads to mystical spiritual opening. These are the kinds of experiences that led Carl Gustav Jung, the famous Swiss psychiatrist, to the assumption that we don't have just the Freudian individual unconscious, which was just sort of a reject of elements from our personal life, but that we have this incredible reservoir of information about the entire cultural history of humanity.
In his travels and studies, Jung saw mythologies as the expression of the collective unconscious. When stories, images or symbols appeared in similar form but in different cultures, he called them archetypes. These represent a common human inheritance of patterns of thought and action or basic psychological instincts.
It is quite certain that man is born with a certain functioning, a certain way of functioning, a certain pattern of behavior, and that is expressed in the form of archetypal images, of archetypal forms.
The author, Count Nikolai Tolstoy.
It's very hard to explain, it seems to me, for the universality of certain myths, which repeat themselves, and sometimes or very often, in strikingly similar detail in very different cultures and societies. And I don't see how that could be explained unless there's something springing up, so to speak, from universally within men, which Jung gave this term, the collective unconscious.
The collective unconscious is that set of building blocks from which human reality is made. It's as if there is this great reservoir outside of time and space, patterns, energy. Mankind struggles to give a definition like this, from which everything is drawn or everything is made.
One needs to keep in mind that when there are certain similarities in traditions, that does not necessarily mean that one tradition got it from the other. And of course what you usually would say is, well, the later tradition must have got it from the earlier one. But it can also mean that seers and sages of several traditions have had similar experiences. And that from these experiences then they drew certain conclusions. So that when they codified their teachings, their experiences of course went there. And that one can have certain types of spiritual experiences, whether one is in India or whether one is in Ceylon or whether one is on the American continent or in the Middle East or anywhere else.
Jung had visited Alexandria quite early in his career. It is also interesting to know that while Jung was at least 3 times, probably more often to my knowledge, in the city of Alexandria, he had never in his entire life visited the city of Rome, which is not very far from Switzerland. Because it would seem that Jung had such an orientation to the origins, to the source, the Urquelle, as they call it in German, the original source of the spirituality of Western culture, that he had a resentment against what was made out of it in Rome. Now it was really Jung's feeling that this can be done, this ought to be done today just as well as it was in the 3rd century, in the 1st century, just as it was done by the mysteries of Osiris and Isis, and the Eleusinian mysteries and the Hermetics, and the Gnostic Christians, and in their own way by the alchemists. This can still be done once we recover and understand the nature of that situation and that method. And so he felt that after the passing of all of these centuries, now the recovery of these powerful myths and of let's say, the first-hand evidence of that experiential early spirituality might possibly stimulate our culture to a similar approach to transcendental experience.
So many of our illnesses and perhaps also our visions, our epiphanies, our intuitions, the good things that happen to us, come to us from that deeper mind, from that unconscious. And so to be in touch with that, to listen to its intimations, and then to interpret them intelligently so that the conscious mind can to some degree relate itself to it, translate it in a workable fashion into conscious life. This is the art of life. And this is what people have done as far back as we can trace them in history. They were already there. And this is what we need to do ourselves. Because when there is no adequate communication between that inner and the outer, then life is tremendously, tremendously impoverished. And in turn, the more communication there is with that mysterious world, the more life is enriched.
The purpose of religion is not to impose doctrine upon man, but to release truth through man. It is not the end of faith that men should actually come to accept one religion as primarily superior to another, but to accept the fact that religion per se is the sum of all its parts, and that the great religious mystery, which deals with the redemption and restoration of human consciousness, is a total mystery. In ancient times, religious institutions were termed mysteries. The mystery system, as it was anciently practiced, has virtually disappeared from our world. There are vestiges of it in Asia and the Near East, but it is comparatively unknown to Western man. This tremendous center of energy, this center for the releasing of the spiritual laws by which the lives of all things are governed, this center was set up as the primary religious focus of mankind. All religion known to man comes from there. All religion is an unfoldment or a revelation of the realities that are associated with this great center.
At the critical period of the early rise of Christianity, a great number of pagans were converted to the Christian faith. Among these were several brilliant persons of unusual attainment, and most certainly initiates of the pagan mysteries in their earlier lives. These men are almost in complete accord with whatever the mysteries of the Greeks were. They were not profane. These rituals were, as one of the early Christian converts declared, of the purest possible nature. There was nothing corrupt or decadent in them. They were solemn, sacred occasions, marked by solemnity of spirit, dignity, graciousness, beauty, and piety. We might assume that such would be the case, otherwise it is not possible that the greatest minds of the ancient world would have found in these rituals and ceremonies profound inspiration. We also have every reason to note that the Neoplatonists, who attempted the restoration of these mysteries, did so on an entirely mystical level, that their philosophy dealt primarily with theurgy, which was the transmutation or transformation of knowledge into an energy for the vitalizing of the consciousness of the soul. Thus, if we can assume that underneath the Greek ritual there was this same element that has always been beneath the surface of religion since the dawn of time, then the Greeks would be perfectly understandable and explainable in the light of the common world attitude. We know that such mysteries were practiced among the Jewish people. We know that the Sassoon, or the Assembly of the Enlightened, was a very important body within Jewish metaphysics. We know that the pre-Islamic cults of the Near East had their esoteric doctrines. So did the Chaldeans and Babylonians in the valley of the Euphrates. We know there was magic and mystery in the rites of Egypt, and of course in all of the great systems of Asiatic culture. Assuming then, as Pythagoras has given us sufficient insight to permit us to assume, that the Eleusinian mysteries were not a unique attitude, but were really only part of a distribution representing a culture level, then Pythagoras would have been correct when he said that having visited India and been initiated into the mysteries of the Brahmins at Elephanta and Ellora, and having in all passed through 21 different religious institutions by initiation, returned and said that they all taught the same thing, and that this same thing that they taught was the same that the Greek mysteries taught. If they all taught the same thing, it is almost inevitable that we are dealing with some form of basic metaphysical equation. Otherwise, certainly, Pythagoras could not have included early Brahmanism with its mass of metaphysical speculation as being the same as the initiation rituals of the Greeks. If, therefore, we are dealing now with what seems we must deal with, the presence of an esoteric factor, we get into a very deep and mysterious and complicated region. We know, for instance, that among the Greeks came into existence most of the arts and sciences of Western culture. We know that the Greeks were master mathematicians. We know that they established the foundations of music and astronomy. We know that they were leaders of the world in rhetoric, in logic, and in many other branches of learning. These forms of learning all apparently originated in the temple. All of the greater initiates were men of unusual scholarship, and nearly all of the great scholars of the Greeks were initiates.
To a major extent, the arrival of Gnosticism, both in its Christian form and the Hermetic Gnosis, were the re-embodiment or the continuation within the early Christian era of the impulse that had started long ago in the Mediterranean world in the form of the mysteries. And so this is very important, I think, to keep in mind that for a long time, prior to the coming of the Christian era, prior to the coming of Christian Gnosticism, there existed a form of spirituality in the Mediterranean world which was directed not to belief and behavior after the fashion of the popular folk religiosity of every period and of every geographical location, but rather to something else, namely the essential transformation, the interior self-discovery, and thereby the spiritualization of the individual. This task was addressed throughout the ancient world by what were called the mysteries. And then there were others who tried to make a much more prosaic, a much more historicized, factually oriented kind of mainstream religion out of early Christianity. The people who pursued the path of the mysteries within the newly arisen Christian matrix were the ones who came to be called Gnostics. You must remember that the early Christian movement had a lot of scriptures. It wasn't just the four Gospels and the Old Testament. And it was a matter of selection, a sort of a selective censorship that went on for a considerable period of time, wherein the prosaic, the non-mystical party came to decide which of these scriptures were the ones that would be safe for use according to their purposes. And since they were champions of what became the mainstream church, their writings were preserved, while the Gnostic writings had to be hidden in caves and under the sand of Nag Hammadi. And so these fellows, some of whom were Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Epiphanius, Tertullian, Eusebius, these were the people who said that what happened was this. Within the Christian communities there arose some unpleasant people. And these unpleasant people were referred to more often by others than by thyself as toi gnostikoi, those people who know something, the knowers. And that they had ideas of their own, which were not identical with the ideas of the, quote, church.
Gnostics are the people who wrote most of the texts known as the Nag Hammadi Library. Their stories about Christ are much more abstract and philosophical than those of the New Testament.
When some of us were in graduate school, we first got to know these other Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas. We were told, well, these are Gnostic, these are heretical, these are weird and strange. We were told that Gnostics means, people who are basically wrong. And this is sort of like in the 1940s and 50s in this country, you talk about the communists. And that's a way of dismissing them. So Gnostic is a term like that. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Christians.
Early church fathers fought against the Gnostics.
One of the difficulties that the Gnostics presented for people in the emerging Orthodox Church was the fact that Gnostics didn't need to have the advice and the control and the insight that came from the priests and the bishops. They had that insight in themselves, and that bothered the church.
Prior to the 3rd or 4th centuries, Christianity had been very different from the way it was after Constantine, the Council of Nicaea, and the 4th century, that a big change had taken place. And in the course of that change, a story which had once been a universal pagan myth, belonged to the Greeks, before them to the Sumerians, and particularly to the Egyptians, that myth had been clad in Jewish form and made into a history, into a literal story. And that's what struck me when I saw that had happened, and the way in which they were prepared to kill, to burn books, to destroy the evidence of it having happened, that I realized something untoward was really at work here. A deliberate campaign was initiated to wipe out all evidence of the connection with the pagan roots of Christianity.
Why would the Christian church do that?
They did it for this reason, because the pagans were mocking them and saying, you have taken our stories, our virgin births, our crucifixions, our everything, and you have just literalized it for the common masses and made it a simple story, and I mean, it's ridiculous. And so the early church fathers, they tried two tacks. First of all, they said, well, if there are similarities, the devil must have, by pre-plagiarism, have planted them there ahead of time. That was not very convincing. These were bright people, these philosophers. When that didn't work, they started to wipe them out. They got serious. They closed the philosophical schools. They closed the school of Plato at Athens that had been going for 4 or 5 centuries at that point. They burned pagan libraries. They burned the library at Alexandria, which has just recently been reopened after all these many centuries, containing up to 750,000 priceless books to destroy any evidence. In fact, any picture we have of paganism comes through Christian eyes, and so naturally they get a bad press, that they were the losers in the battle. And so you have to ask yourself, what's going on here when you have to destroy your enemy, you have to anathematize him, you have to burn his or her books, and you have to actually put a person like Hypatia, who was a lecturer at that library in Alexandria, put her to death in a horrible fashion. Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, for example, that's the ongoing struggle that each one of us has in our daily life. When he said to to the crowd, take up your cross and follow me, he wasn't talking about that thing that Mel Gibson had in that obscenity of a movie, carrying it up the hill. He was saying, take the cross of incarnation, the fact that you are a spirit involved with matter, and struggle with that and accept it and work that out. The basic datum of all religion belongs to the one myth that you can find pieces of in every part of the world, is incarnation. That is to say, that in some form or other the human being has a spark, an image, a flame, it's expressed in different religions in so many different ways, of the divine. That is the golden fleece, that's the golden vow, that's the Holy Grail, not some feminine principle or the bones of Mary Magdalene. The Holy Grail is the reality of the Christ, as Christians would call it, within. If you're going to take the literal approach and say that this reading from the Gospel, walking on the water or whatever it might be, if you're going to just accept that as literal as yesterday's newspaper, it's ludicrous. And the average, ordinary person today knows it is. Christianity is already, I mean, when is this Christmas? Christmas has to happen at the solstice of the sun. But you hardly ever hear a mention of the solstice around Christmas. But that's why it's anchored there. All the gods were born on December the 25th, 3 days after the solstice. Why is Easter always hooked in to the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox? It's an equinoctial religion. It's a solstitial religion. It belongs to the cosmos, but we narrow it down to one paragon of virtue who's outside, and we rob each other. If everything is in Jesus, all the fullness of God, then you and I have been robbed of our potential divinity.
Of the notion that God is incarnate.
Yes, in each one of us.
Each of us.
And therefore the evolutionary thrust that can come from that is missing.
The basic images, the basic vocabulary of the Christian tradition is the same as the basic vocabulary of all the great religions. Inflected, however, in terms of a European experience. When the Spaniards arrived first in Mexico, they were astounded to find that the Aztecs had all of the 7 sacraments: baptism, confirmation, holy orders, Holy Eucharist, matrimony, extreme unction, the whole lot. Also there was a deity Quetzalcoatl, who was associated with a virgin birth, death and resurrection, a cross, and they thought that the devil was throwing up mockeries of their religion to frustrate the mission. Going from there, you'd go to Polynesia, you'd go to Africa, you can find the whole thing. And then, by golly, I began finding them in the American Indian myths. And there we were again. Well, there we were for the first time, as far as I was concerned. Then the thing comes all over the world. Carl Jung, in his psychology, has called these basic forms the archetypes of the unconscious. We all have 2 levels in our psyche. One, the level of our personal life, the personal accidents of our life, which Jung calls the personal unconscious. And that corresponds to the Freudian unconscious. But deeper than that, antecedent to that, are the psychological structures that are functions of our biology. And all of this is part and parcel of our being, so that we can experience imagery in terms of our human as well as in terms of our particular personal and national and provincial consciousness. And what the myths do is open us to that great, wider sphere.
For more than 2,000 years, until the 4th century after Christ, Eleusis was the beating heart of the ancient Greek world. they would have life-transforming experiences. Plato was an initiate, Sophocles was an initiate, Cicero was an initiate, Pindar was an initiate. They all said that the experience they had had in the Telestrion after drinking the brew was life-changing. They lost utterly their fear of death. They knew that death was not the end, but just the beginning of the next great adventure. And those spaces were the heart of everything that was good and worthy and worthwhile about ancient Greek culture. And it's a comment upon the way that civilization has gone, that it was fanatical early Christianity that destroyed Eleusis and that put an end to those rites that had been so life-affirming and so life-enhancing for so long. And this is true, frankly, all around the world, whether you go to ancient India, whether you go to ancient Mexico, of course to ancient South America. In South America, we have a whole pyramid city called Caral, which has only been excavated in the last 15 years. And, you know, archaeologists went to it with their prejudices. Nobody could have created a huge place like this unless they were highly domineering and hierarchical and making war on others. Turns out there's no evidence of warfare whatsoever at Caral.
The Christian view is very strongly marked by the idea that of man's fall, that we screwed up early on, and somehow then, by virtue of that, we're forced into a secondary position in the cosmic drama. We are doing penance as we speak. The world is a vale of tears. The lot of human beings is to till hard land, and, we are cursed. Hermetic philosophy is based on what is called the Hermetic corpus. This is a group of books, the most important of which is called the Asclepius. And these books, most of them, were completely lost during the Middle Ages. At the fall of the Roman Empire, copies of these Hermetic manuscripts were systematically destroyed by enthusiastic Christian barbarians. Well, I want to read you some of this stuff because it's very interesting, and it has a modernity that is astonishing. Very different from the humble yourself, hard labor, spun wool and watery beer approach of medieval Christianity. It's very readable. It's very literary. It's highly poetic. It's a celebration of nature. The notion of sin is completely absent, and it rings with a kind of confidence, a kind of joy that was completely running counter to the brimstone and damnation point of view of Christianity.
And let us think for a moment now what happened when the mysteries of Greece finally drifted into the Roman Empire. And now we come to another problem. We know that the Romans were a very strange people that seem to have suffered from a profound inferiority complex. Like most great materialistic states, the Romans were keenly aware of their own ignorance. They knew they were barbarians and admitted it. They knew they were very successful barbarians. They knew that they could conquer culture, but they could not attain it. They realized that to the Greeks they would always be a group of uncouth barbarians. They could control the bodies of the Greeks, but Greek learning could not be controlled. And gradually, as part of the spoils of war and conquest, the Greek mysteries were transferred to Rome. Now, in all probability, with very, very few exceptions, the Greek mysteries never reached Rome, actually. It is very doubtful if the Greeks ever permitted the theophany of the mysteries to be practiced among the Romans. It is quite possible that some of their priests, some of their hierophants, still possessed this knowledge. and could at will confer it. But I think that it was at the time of the transference of the mysteries to Rome that what we call the esoteric part was simply wiped away. It was never revealed. The Romans received the body of the ritual. But whatever it was that led to this experience of eternity, the Roman was not able to take. Whether it was merely a matter of the fact that he could not or would not fulfill the obligations of the mysteries, or whether by his very background he was unlearned and by being such a savage was unacceptable to the priest, we don't know. But it was in Rome that the great rituals, for example, of the Dionysiac descended to the organs of the Bacchanalia. It was here that all of the great institutions of Greek learning were profaned. And it was also from this area that most of the opinions of modern writers about these mysteries originate. Why? For the simple reason that at this time there was nothing to conceal. The oaths and obligations were not taken seriously. The time that the mysteries reached Rome, then, the true rites were no longer practiced. Now, whatever the rituals and rites were, undoubtedly, could be practiced if the need arose, at least for a time, although it is possible that with the passing of several centuries, the secrets died out. There is a reason to believe that the Greek rites were practiced and observed with these magical and mystical parts as late as the 7th or 8th century of the Christian era. By this time, however, they had mingled their courses with the early Gnostic and other esoteric societies and were simply no longer state mysteries. They were then mysteries of secret schools of teachers and the beginning of the adept tradition in the Western world. But, occasionally at least, these rituals were conferred, apparently legitimately, upon certain Romans. There is every reason from what we are able to learn that Cicero was initiated. That he was not initiated into the Bacchanalia, but was initiated into the genuine Dionysian rites. From this occurrence and from this circumstance, we can understand what he meant when he said that these sublime mysteries not only teach men to live well in this world, but to meet the world beyond with a good hope. This, I think, is the key to it. I think perhaps Cicero has unwittingly told the story. Another who was definitely initiated was the Emperor Julian, who was initiated at Ephesus and was initiated in the ancient way, receiving the full ritual and the mystery, whatever was being at that time practiced. And Julian probably deserved it, inasmuch as he had been all his life a profound student. Still, he was a Neoplatonist in his own right. His great hymns to the sovereign Son and the Mother of the Gods indicates true enlightenment, and therefore it is quite reasonable to suspect that the initiation which was given to him at Ephesus was genuine. Another who was certainly initiated, and so refers to it in his own writings, was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, whose meditations are among the great masterpieces of world literature. But I can find no records, actually, that any of these Roman initiates, Cicero, Julian, Antoninus, or many of the others, were actually initiated in Rome. They seem to have had to go to Greece, or one of the outlying Greek states, or one of the boundary states between the actual area of Roman supremacy and the unconquered world. It was only in the outskirts of the empire, far from the pressures of imperial despotism, that the genuine mysteries were conferred during the period of the Roman Empire. As far as we are able to learn also, the Emperor Justinian officially forced the closure of the Greek mysteries. He did so after his conversion to Christianity. For by that time, there seems to be no indication that the Christian rites retained the actual experience of the resurrection. In other words, the Christian ritual of the early centuries undoubtedly had something to do with this death and resurrection mystery. This resurrection of man from the mystery of body. But by the 6th century, this had disappeared in Christianity, and at least had retired to a symbolic state. And when we go in another lecture in this series into the problem of Brahmin initiation, I think we may get a very good clue to this, because Pythagoras is known to have visited India, and it is quite conceivable that some of the changes that later arose in the mystery were due to the commerce of minds between the East and West. There seems to be only one thing that could have been communicated in the Eleusinian, under its symbolism, by its rites, through its ceremonies, and perhaps through an absolute theophanic incident of some nature, a true theophany, a true experience, namely that in some way the candidate in initiation experienced the actual fact of life after death. This seems to have been about the only explanation we have. For it is still, in our world, a supreme mystery. Today, our way of life is built upon a hope of an afterlife. There was a hope of an afterlife in the time of Plato and Socrates. Socrates was not sure of it, but rather optimistic. Plato was convinced of it. Pythagoras knew it as early as the 5th and 6th centuries BC, but he was in India. We know that Apollonius of Tyana later visited India. We have every reason to assume the possibility that it was from this type of contact that he brought back some of the information and some of the teaching that was to affect Neoplatonism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, and Gnosticism. But if in the Greek rituals, the myth of the dying god, the myth representing the death and resurrection of Attis, for whom, as for Adonis, the women wept at the gates of Jerusalem, if the mystery of the death and resurrection of the god was in some way closely associated with the mystery of the death and resurrection of human consciousness, Then we have the element of a great Eucharistic mystery. We have the elements of a great resurrection rite, which we know these things were, but we know that they were rites of great rejoicing. They were not rites of fear or of intimidation. Those who came forth out of the mysteries came forth, their faces radiant as with the light of 1,000 suns, says one of the old rituals. These persons have been lifted up in some extraordinary way. The only thing that was of immense value and immediate value was the experience of the individual of having a life apart from body. That the destruction of the body was not the destruction of life. That he survived the disintegration of the body as a conscious living being. Now it is true that in the rituals the body was not disintegrated. But this perhaps also is not too important. For the important thing was the realization of a conscious existence separate from body. This may have been all that was needed or indicated. The sudden realization that the body and the spirit were not the same thing. The sudden realization that the life does not cease with the body. This in itself would change the entire course of human history. It would change every policy that we know. It would end forever this terrible thing which we call materialism.
They understood how to create sacred spaces in which the human experience of mystery and of the divine could be amplified. And these sacred spaces include the great temples of Upper Egypt, the Temple of Horus at Edfu, for example, the Temple of Seti I at Abydos in Upper Egypt. These are amazing places. The moment that you enter them, you can feel that something's working on your consciousness. Even today, thousands of years after they were decommissioned, after they ceased to be part of a functioning society, they still reach out to us and touch us at an extremely deep level. The Great Pyramid is the classic example of that. The lie told by archaeologists is that the Great Pyramid was the tomb of some megalomaniac pharaoh. It's been clear to me for a very long time that the Great Pyramid was never a tomb. And it functions as a beacon. It still functions as a beacon. It draws people towards it from all over the world. They don't even know why they're drawn towards it. It selects its own initiates. For some people, it's just a heap of stones. For others, it's a sacred mystery. And those are the ones that the Great Pyramid speaks to, and it was designed to do that. So, although the creation of temples and sacred architecture is the work of organized hierarchical societies, we have the example particularly of ancient Egypt, which tells us that that work can be good. It can touch the human soul in a wonderful, thought out, beautiful way. And this is a civilization that devoted its best minds for 3,000 years to considering the mystery of life and death and the mystery of existence, and found a beautiful way to function in the world. Unfortunately, as time goes on, you get a new force coming into the world, and those are the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Those sacred temples of Egypt were not about enhancing the power of the priesthood. They were about giving individuals the additional support to access mystery. What we have in the big monotheistic faiths is something very different. We have the priests and the rabbis and the mullahs who are imposing themselves between us and the divine. We are to only experience the divine with their permission, their way, through their system. And this then ceases to be something that serves the human spirit, and it becomes something that's part of the system of control in our society. So what I observe is that sacred spaces and temples have become denaturized as time has gone on. They've become a home of bureaucracy rather than a home of spiritual experience. The Great Pyramid, I've climbed it 5 times. I've been in every known chamber in the Great Pyramid. It is a work of stunning artistic achievement. You're looking at the work of masters of architecture at the peak of their skill, not an unwilling labor force, but people who gave their labor to that work with love and with care and with attention. There are blocks of stone weighing 70 tons that have been raised more than 300 feet above the ground. They got it all right, and nobody today can explain how they did it, with the knowledge that is supposed to have been available in ancient Egypt in the Old Kingdom, and with the tools that are supposed to have been available. And that's why I can't help feeling that we are missing some chapter from the human story. And I've continued that relationship with the past. I think that's where we need to disentangle the truth most urgently, because if we've got our past wrong, then that's part of why we've got our present wrong as well.
It's about one of your local heroes who is a great hero of mine. And I'm talking about Frederick V, Elector Palatine, Prince of Heidelberg, King of Bohemia, who was not content to sit back and let things happen, but was willing to launch a grand alchemical dream of a reformation of human society. Okay, this is a prophecy in the Hermetic literature. A day will come when men will no longer care for the earth, and at that day the gods will depart and everything will be thrown into primal chaos. This prophecy was strongly in the minds of the strains of non-Christian thought that evolved at the centuries of closure of the Roman Empire. A world whose psychology was very much like the psychology of our own time, a psychology of despair and exhaustion. But this spirit is the spirit of life itself, the spirit of novelty itself, and it will not be suppressed for long in any time or place. So now again, it comes. It's a spirit of dissent that says we will not serve the values of materialism, the values of the ego, and the values that separate and break down the community.
How do we interpret a vision? Something which is apparently seen other than by ordinary sight. Do we simply deny it any relevance to life? Call it meaningless? Declare it a sensory aberration? Are things seen within with the second sight, in vision, merely phantom shadows of outward reality? Do we pathologize this experience if we allow it happens? Do we call it an illness of the mind or the brain? A disorder of perception of reality mediated by some natural and recurrent aberrancy of neural tissue. And here I say natural and recurrent, because it does appear to be a fact of human nature, and over millennia it does seem to be recurrent. Well, look, as a doctor, I know about the pathology of hallucination. And I should also add, when these events happen, people often relate them in religious or spiritual traditional formats. Because where else do you have a language? Okay, this other word, this strange word, hermeneutics. How does one interpret vision? Hermeneutics is the art of interpretation. The art of moving meaning between domains of expression and understanding. Historically, the term was often linked with the Greek god Hermes, who was the one who brought messages from gods to men. The one who went betwixt realms, worlds, realities, communicating, translating. It is the art of Hermes. In Western tradition, the hermeneutic art originally centered on the interpretation of sacred writ, on how one should interpret prophetic, visionary, biblical texts. Were these texts to be read as accurate and precise histories of real events, perhaps histories with a moral? Or were they to be read allegorically? Or was there something else hidden in them, some other intention in these supposed sacred and mythic accounts? And then much later, from the early 19th century onward, hermeneutics moved into wider spheres, into methods and the philosophical difficulties of interpreting any text, any creative human act, human work. Writing in 1950, when Jung was 75 years old, he explained his situation 40 years earlier, at the threshold of the visionary experience that produced his Red Book. The book he inscribed on its spine with the title, Liber Novus, the New Book. And I quote, "The psyche is not of today. Its ancestry goes back many millions of years. Individual consciousness is only the flower and the fruit of a season, sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth. And it would find itself in better accord with the truth if it took the existence of the rhizome into its calculations. For the root matter is the mother of all things." He recounted, looking back to what had happened to him on the threshold of this visionary event, he recounted that his intense study of mythologies, which had taken place in 1909, 1910, 1911, when he was about 35 years old, forced him to conclude that without a myth, a human is, quote, like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or with the ancestral life which continues within him, or yet with contemporary society. He continued on. So, I suspected that myth had a meaning, which I was sure to miss if I lived outside it in the haze of my own speculations. I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living? I found no answer to this question and had to admit that I was not living with a myth or even in a myth. So in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth. And I regarded this as the task of tasks. I simply had to know what unconscious or preconscious myth was forming me, from what rhizome, what root I sprang. Beginning in the fall of 1913, when he was about 38 years old, and continuing over the next several years, he confronted this portentous task of tasks. He later described it as a voyage of discovery to the other pole of the world. Or in other words, the place where the mirror image begins. And he found his myth. He found his rhizome, the root from which he sprang. And more. Was he ill? I mean, did he need, drugs to fix his illness? Maybe he was threatened with a psychosis. He had visions. He went searching through all of his own story, trying to remember dreams, trying to figure out how he could understand this, maybe even abort what might be a psychotic event. Finally, he knew he just had to give in. He just had to see what it was that was petitioning him. And so on the night of the 12th of November of 1913, he sat at his desk, he reached in to the drawer, he pulled out a journal that he had not written in for 11 years, and he addressed his soul. It's one of the most heart-rending verses I've read. And it starts, my soul, where are you? Then he started doing the interpretation of what this had happened. And 9 months later he started trying to figure this out. And this is what he said, trying to explain what had happened. He said, if you remain within the arbitrary and artificially created boundaries, you will walk as between two high walls. You do not see the immensity of the world. But if you break down the walls that confine your view, then the ancient sleeper awakens in you. If you look outside yourself, you see the far-off forest and mountains, and above them your vision climbs to the realms of the stars. And if you look into yourselves, you will see, on the other hand, the nearby as far off and infinite, since the world of the inner is as infinite as the world of the outer. Man lives in two worlds. And during all this period, he was also doing something else. He was looking for those who might have shared a similar experience. Paradigmatic cases. Anything to indicate that what he had quite clearly experienced, this visionary realm, was a human experience, and that there were records that he could use to relate what had happened to him. By the early 1920s, he wrote this book to others. He thought he would publish it. It was only by the early 1920s he realized it was absolutely impossible. There were people around him who thought he should publish it, and he saw it was impossible, that no one would understand this. No one could understand what had happened to him. He had to develop a way of approaching such events in history, in his history, in human history. He thought it was vital to do so. And he spent the rest of his life working on that hermeneutics, that interpretive act of bringing people into an understanding of such events in history, looking for the paradigmatic cases, and he laid out a number of them. He was a historian, a physician who was an historian looking for the history of this experience. And if you read his collected writings, I mean, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Meditations of Ignatius of Loyola, Meister Eckhart, these are all the texts. Kundalini. These were the things he was studying and looking at, trying to understand what had happened to him. And at the very beginning of his looking, he thought he had found an analog of his experience in the ancient writings of the Gnostics. Heretics, so-called. Visionaries. Creating new myths at the beginning of the Christian age. Jung had seen in his visions not only the coming of a war, but the coming to an end of an age. He felt that we had actually lost our myths. That a new myth of consciousness, a new myth of what it was to be human, maybe what might be called a new type of God story, was about to begin taking formation. He saw that in human consciousness there had been major ages. He called them ions, periods of thousands of years, reaching back 6,000 years. The Christian age, the third age, was coming to an end. We were at a time of catastrophic danger. If we did not face the fact of the imaginable, of the vision, which is our nature, of the stories in us which in this age are trying to come to the surface, be known, be heard, be found, be written, and perhaps be interpreted, we were in trouble. Late in life, he said, the world hangs by a thread, and that thread is the psyche, the soul, and its imaginal words, languages, forms, myths. He was looking at what it was to be human. Dr. Sonu Shamdasani introduced the Red Book at the Library of Congress in 2010. They had a big museum show there and a conference. And Sonu gave an amazing talk. And again, it's one of those things you can find on YouTube if you go looking. And Sonu talked about Jung's approach to Blake and Swedenborg, visionaries, and compared Jung's approach to these individuals, what he'd said about them. And then he concluded with these words. This is what Dr. Shamdasani said. Quote, if, as Jung claimed, Dante and Blake clothed visionary experience in mythological forms, could we not pose the question, did Jung in turn attempt to clothe visionary experience in conceptual, psychological forms? If so, the power and significance of his work does not reside in his concepts, which are familiar to us, but in the visionary experience which was at the back of them. End quote. Dr. Shamdasani is the Philbin Professor of Jung History at the University College London. He's in his mid-50s now. He is certainly the most knowledgeable historian of Jung I know. He spent more than half his life involved in this stuff. He spent now 20 years working on the Red Book, Jung's diaries from this period, his collected writings thereafter. What was the man's conclusion? The power and significance of his work does not reside in his concepts, which are familiar to us, but in the visionary experience, which was at the back of them.
Jung was quite sure that man is not complete without a living mythology or religion. Unlike his European patients, tribal people had a sense of meaning to their lives.
He realized that people have to live their own myths,
And it was important to him that they were related to something important, they were related to something greater than themselves, and that is all that matters.
Just a few months before he died, Jung summarized the religious emphasis of his life's work in a letter to an English correspondent.
It's an amazing letter. One of the passages that struck me most strongly was one where he says, "I have failed in my foremost task to open people's eyes to the fact that man has a soul, that there is a buried treasure in the field, and that our religion and philosophy are in a lamentable state."
Jung's work covered more than just clinical observation. He considered the psychological meaning of mythology and fairy tales, of alchemy, astrology, and flying saucers. He received honorary doctorates all around the world on his 80th birthday in 1955. Despite his vast range of work and thought, and the international reputation he had gained, Jung retained his humor and humility.
I made some comment about his encyclopedic knowledge. The reason it was so meaningful to me was that it didn't come out like knowledge, that it wasn't, he wasn't casting pearls before swine, and he wasn't preaching a gospel, and he wasn't doing any of those things. And he said, the older I get, and he was a child of about 75, I guess, and he said, the older I get, the more I realize that I don't know enough to entirely cover my little fingernail, to be room for a bit more.
Jung spent his life in the pioneering work of bringing together the conscious outer part of the psyche with the rich, deeper energies of the unconscious. When Carl Gustav Jung died and was buried in the family grave in the churchyard at Kusnacht, the village pastor declared he had given man the courage to have a soul again.